Across America, something extraordinary is happening. While thousands of traditional churches are closing every year, Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, one kind of church is quietly exploding in growth. They don't have denominations. They don't have bishops or hierarchies. They don't even have labels. And yet, millions are flocking to them. Welcome to the rise of the non-denominational church, the fastest-growing movement in modern Christianity. For decades, religion experts have told us that Christianity in America is dying. But that's only half the story, because while traditional denominations are shrinking, independent churches are thriving. In 2007, only 4.5% of American adults attended non-denominational churches. Today, that number has jumped to 6.2%. That might not sound dramatic, but in absolute numbers, it's staggering. That represents millions of people. And among Protestants specifically, the numbers are even more striking. 13% now identify with non-denominational churches, up from 9% in 2007. Between 2010 and 2020 alone, over 4,000 new non-denominational churches opened their doors. And those churches saw 6.5 million more people in attendance by the end of that decade. Meanwhile, traditional denominations are hemorrhaging members. The United Methodist Church has seen membership drop from about 3 million to 2 million, with potentially 40% of its membership gone after the full effects of recent church departures. The Presbyterian Church USA, the Episcopal Church, and the United Church of Christ each lost 40% of their members between 2000 and 2015. The Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination, has been described as being in statistical freefall for 2 decades by Baptist News. So what's happening here? Why are people leaving denominations that have existed for hundreds of years and joining churches that didn't even exist a generation ago? For many, it's about freedom. No rigid structure, no old traditions, no committees or hierarchies, just open doors, modern music, relatable preaching, and a focus on personal connection over institutional control. A member of one such church said, "It feels like family, not religion." And that's exactly the appeal. Non-denominational churches don't tell people what denomination they belong to. They just say, "Come as you are." But critics say there's another side. They warn that without accountability, theology can become shallow, focused on emotion, entertainment, or even celebrity pastors. So what's driving this movement, revival or rebranding? Some see it as a backlash against traditional religion, a generational rebellion. Others see it as renewal, a return to the heart of faith, stripped of politics and ritual. Either way, this movement is reshaping Christianity faster than any denomination in the past century. Sociologists call it the Great Realignment, a time when people aren't abandoning faith, they're just abandoning labels. And it's not just an American story anymore. From Nigeria to South Korea to Brazil, the non-denominational model, free, local, emotionally engaging, is redefining how billions experience Christianity. But there's a deeper question beneath the numbers. If Christianity no longer needs denominations, what will unite the church in the future? When every church writes its own rules, how do we stay connected to something larger than ourselves? This is not just a story about religion, it's about transformation. It's about how faith adapts to culture and how people search for belonging in an age of disconnection. So today, we're going to explore the rise of the non-denominational church, how it began, why it's spreading so fast, what the concerns are, and what it means for the future of Christianity. Because this isn't just a trend, it's a revolution in faith, and it's happening right now. Let's start by defining what we're actually talking about, because non-denominational can mean different things to different people. At its most basic level, a non-denominational church is a Christian congregation that operates independently of any larger denominational structure. There's no Southern Baptist headquarters to report to, no United Methodist bishop overseeing decisions, no Presbyterian General Assembly setting policy. These churches are autonomous. They govern themselves. They hire their own pastors, set their own budgets, establish their own theology, and make their own decisions about everything from worship style to social issues. Now, this doesn't mean they're completely isolated. Many non-denominational churches are part of loose networks or associations that provide resources, training, and fellowship without exercising formal authority. Organizations like the Association of Related Churches, ARC, support independent church plants and provide coaching and resources. As of December 2022, ARC alone had helped launch over 1,000 churches globally. But these are cooperative relationships, not hierarchical ones. The theology of non-denominational churches varies widely. Some are theologically conservative, others more progressive. Some emphasize charismatic worship with speaking in tongues and healing, while others are more restrained. Some focus heavily on evangelism and conversion, others on social justice and community service. What unites them isn't doctrine or practice. It's structure, or rather, the lack of traditional denominational structure. And that structural freedom is precisely what's drawing millions of people. So why is this movement growing so fast while denominations decline? Researchers and church leaders have identified several key factors. First, non-denominational churches tend to be more evangelistic. They focus heavily on reaching people who don't currently attend church anywhere. Ryan Burge, a political scientist and Baptist pastor who has researched this trend extensively, notes that non-denominational churches are designed for growth. They invest significant resources in outreach, marketing, and creating welcoming environments for newcomers. Traditional denominational churches, by contrast, often focus more on maintaining existing members and preserving traditions. They're pastorally oriented, caring for the flock they have, rather than evangelistically oriented toward attracting new people. Second, non-denominational churches typically invest more financially in reaching their communities. Without denominational dues or bureaucratic overhead, these churches can direct more of their budget toward local programs, community events, advertising, and facilities that attract visitors. They're more likely to invest in contemporary worship technology, professional sound systems, lighting, video screens. They create coffee shops, play areas for children, comfortable seating. They're designing spaces that feel less like traditional churches and more like welcoming community centers. Third, non-denominational churches usually don't engage in divisive controversies the way denominational churches do. This is huge. Over the past few decades, major denominations have been torn apart by debates over sexuality, gender, politics, and theology. The United Methodist Church split over LGBTQ+ ordination and marriage. The Presbyterian Church and Episcopal Church have seen similar divisions. The Southern Baptist Convention has battled over women in leadership, political alignment, and handling of abuse scandals. These fights are exhausting. They dominate denominational meetings, church newsletters, and pastoral energy, and they drive people away. One former United Methodist pastor explained, "Those issues devastate the sense of community within the church. There are always those who agree and those who disagree about the issue, yet still have much in common. When pastors preach to guide the flock toward their side of the issue, the people who disagree are immediately alienated." Non-denominational churches can sidestep many of these denominational battles. Each congregation decides its own positions without being forced into a larger institutional fight. If you don't like one non-denominational church's stance on an issue, you can simply attend a different one down the street without leaving your whole tradition. Fourth, non-denominational churches don't carry denominational baggage. The word Baptist carries associations, both positive and negative, depending on who you are and where you're from. Same with Methodist, Lutheran, Presbyterian. For some people, these names represent beloved traditions. For others, they represent institutions they've come to distrust. Non-denominational churches start with a blank slate. They're not tied to historical scandals, outdated policies, or cultural assumptions. They can reinvent what church means for a new generation. Ryan Burge observes, "In non-denominational churches, it's not just the institution. It's about the spirituality. You've heard the slogan, 'It's not religion, it's a relationship.' That kind of language is endemic in non-denominational churches and appeals to young people who feel like institutions have let them down." And institutions have let people down. The Catholic abuse scandals, financial mismanagement in megachurches, political hypocrisy, discrimination and exclusion. Young people especially have lost trust in religious institutions. A church that says we're not like those institutions, we're just about Jesus and community, is deeply appealing to that demographic. Fifth, non-denominational churches tend to be newer, and newer churches tend to grow faster. This is a statistical pattern that holds across religious movements. New churches are energized, focused on growth, and haven't yet settled into maintenance mode. They're planting themselves in growing areas, suburbs, new developments, rather than trying to maintain buildings in declining neighborhoods. The rapid rise of non-denominational churches is a relatively recent phenomenon, mostly in the past 30 years. That means most of these churches are still in their growth phase rather than their plateau or decline phase. But there's another factor that's critically important and often overlooked: loneliness. In May 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General declared loneliness a public health epidemic. By early 2024, polls showed that 30% of adults felt lonely at least weekly, with 10% experiencing loneliness daily. Young adults ages 18 to 34 reported even higher rates. Nearly one-third felt lonely daily or several times a week. Single adults were hit hardest. 39% experienced weekly loneliness compared to 22% of married adults. Non-denominational churches have tapped into this crisis brilliantly. Ryan Burge explains, "The churches that tend to decline are the more liberal mainline churches because they don't ask you to change your life that much. The reason that the non-denoms are doing well is because they want their church to become the center of your life, like your social life. They have activities almost every day. There are activities for every age group, young and old. These churches aren't just offering Sunday services. They're offering community, small groups that meet in homes, volunteer opportunities, sports leagues, men's groups, women's groups, singles groups, young professionals groups, parenting groups, coffee mornings, game nights, service projects. For people drowning in loneliness, that level of social infrastructure is life-changing. It's not just about believing certain doctrines. It's about belonging to something real. And that brings us to a crucial insight. Much of non-denominational growth isn't actually conversion growth. It's transfer growth. People aren't primarily becoming Christian because of non-denominational churches. They're already Christian and they're switching from denominational churches to non-denominational ones. Ryan Burge's research confirms this. Baby boomers transferring from mainline churches to larger non-denominational churches has been a major pattern. Immigration is also a factor. Catholics from Central and South America often gravitate toward non-denominational churches when they come to the United States. This means the non-denominational boom is partly about reshuffling the deck, not expanding the overall number of Christians. And that's important context. But it also raises a question. If non-denominational churches are winning the competition for existing Christians, what does that tell us about what people are actually looking for in faith communities? So far, we've painted a mostly positive picture of non-denominational churches. But there are serious concerns too, and we need to address them honestly. The first major concern is theological accountability and depth. When a church belongs to a denomination, there are checks and balances. Denominational bodies set doctrinal standards. They provide oversight. They credential and train pastors. They can discipline churches or remove pastors who go off the rails theologically or ethically. Non-denominational churches don't have that. Each church decides its own theology. Each church hires its own pastor with whatever qualifications or lack thereof they choose. There's no one to step in if things go wrong. This can lead to theological shallowness. Without denominational curricula, training programs, or theological standards, churches can drift toward whatever's popular or emotionally appealing rather than what's doctrinally sound. Some critics argue that non-denominational churches prioritize entertainment over substance. The worship is flashy and emotional, the preaching is motivational and therapeutic, but the actual teaching of Scripture and theology is thin. There's definitely truth to this concern in some cases. Not all non-denominational churches, but enough to make it a pattern. The second concern is the celebrity pastor problem. Without denominational oversight, everything in a non-denominational church can revolve around one charismatic leader. That pastor is the vision, the draw, the brand. And when that person falls morally, theologically, or otherwise, the whole church can collapse. We've seen this repeatedly. Mark Driscoll at Mars Hill Church, Carl Lentz at Hillsong, Bill Hybels at Willow Creek, James MacDonald at Harvest Bible Chapel. High-profile pastors of independent or loosely affiliated churches who built empires around their personalities, then crashed spectacularly, leaving devastation in their wake. Ryan Burge notes, in non-denominational churches, the creep of corruption is limited to the church itself. If a denominational pastor falls, the denomination can step in, remove them, and help the congregation heal. In an independent church, there's often no one to do that. The church just implodes. The third concern is financial transparency and accountability. Denominational churches typically have to report their finances to denominational bodies. There are rules about how money can be spent, how pastors are compensated, and how decisions are made. Non-denominational churches often have no such requirements. The pastor and board decide everything internally. There's no outside audit, no transparency requirements, no accountability to a larger body. This creates opportunities for financial abuse. Pastors can pay themselves exorbitant salaries, spend church money on luxury items, or misuse funds with little oversight. Again, not all non-denominational churches do this. Many are financially responsible and transparent. But the structural lack of accountability creates opportunities for abuse. The fourth concern is doctrinal drift and heresy. Without denominational standards, what stops a non-denominational church from teaching things that are fundamentally unchristian? What prevents a charismatic pastor from inventing their own theology? Denominations preserve historical Christian orthodoxy by maintaining creeds, confessions, and doctrinal statements that churches must adhere to. Non-denominational churches can just make it up as they go. We've seen prosperity gospel theology spread rapidly through non-denominational and independent churches, the teaching that God wants you to be wealthy and that faith is a transaction to get blessings. This theology is considered heretical by most mainstream Christian traditions, but it flourishes in churches without denominational accountability. The fifth concern is about unity and the broader church. Christianity has always had both local expressions and universal identity. You belong to your local congregation, but you're also part of something bigger, the body of Christ, the global church across time and space. Denominations, for all their flaws, connect local churches to that bigger story. They link you to Christians across geography, to historical traditions, to shared beliefs and practices that transcend your individual congregation. When every church is independent, what connects Christians to each other? What unites the church? Ryan Burge asks, if Christianity no longer needs denominations, what will unite the church in the future? This isn't just an abstract theological question. It has practical implications. When crisis hits, pandemic, natural disaster, social unrest, denominational structures coordinate responses, pool resources, and mobilize action. Independent churches are on their own. When theological questions arise, denominational traditions provide centuries of wisdom and debate to draw on. Independent churches are winging it. So while independence offers freedom, it also creates fragmentation. And we have to ask, at what point does that fragmentation undermine the essential unity that Christianity claims to embody? Now, defenders of non-denominational churches have responses to these concerns. They point out that denominations haven't exactly been bastions of accountability either. Abuse scandals have plagued Catholic, Southern Baptist, and other denominational churches. Denominational structures often protected abusers rather than victims. They note that many non-denominational churches do have accountability through networks, partnerships with other churches, elder boards, and financial audits, just not through denominational structures. They argue that theological freedom allows churches to adapt to their contexts and serve their communities better than rigid denominational requirements would. And they emphasize that what they're offering, authentic community, relevant teaching, welcoming environments, is meeting real needs that denominational churches have failed to meet. Both the concerns and the defenses have merit. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Non-denominational churches offer genuine benefits but also carry genuine risks. Now let's zoom out and look at this phenomenon globally, because it's not just an American story. The non-denominational model is exploding in the global South, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. In Nigeria, independent Pentecostal and charismatic churches are the fastest-growing segment of Christianity. These churches operate independently, focus on spiritual power and personal transformation, and create intense community. In South Korea, megachurches like Yoido Full Gospel Church, once the world's largest single congregation with over 800,000 members, operate independently or in loose affiliations. Korean Christianity has been shaped by this entrepreneurial, independent model. In Brazil, neo-Pentecostal churches like the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God have grown explosively as independent entities, often later forming their own networks but remaining outside traditional denominations. What makes this model so exportable? First, it's culturally adaptable. Without denominational traditions rooted in European or American history, these churches can fully embrace local culture, language, music, and practices. They're not importing Western Christianity. They're creating indigenous expressions of faith. Second, it's entrepreneurial and dynamic. In rapidly changing societies, institutions that can move quickly and adapt have an advantage over bureaucratic denominations. Third, it taps into global trends toward decentralization. Just as political movements worldwide are becoming more grassroots and less institutional, religious movements are following the same pattern. Some experts draw parallels between the rise of non-denominational churches and political phenomena like the grassroots rise of populist movements. Both reflect bottom-up rather than top-down organization. Both prioritize local autonomy over institutional control. Both express distrust of established hierarchies. Whether that's a positive or negative parallel depends on your perspective. But it's undeniable that non-denominational Christianity fits broader cultural patterns in the 21st century. So what does the future look like? Let's start with some predictions based on current trends. First, non-denominational churches will likely continue growing, at least in the near term. The factors driving their growth, desire for community, distrust of institutions, preference for cultural relevance, aren't going away. Second, we'll probably see more hybrid models emerge. Some churches may identify as Baptist or Methodist, but operate with increasing independence from denominational structures. Others may form new kinds of networks that provide some benefits of denominational connection without the bureaucracy. Third, as first-generation non-denominational churches age, we'll see whether they can sustain growth into second and third generations, or whether they plateau and decline like denominational churches before them. History suggests that independent movements often eventually create their own institutional structures. The Pentecostal movement started as independent and anti-institutional, but eventually formed denominations like the Assemblies of God. Will non-denominational churches follow the same path? Fourth, the accountability concerns will likely force some changes. As scandals hit high-profile independent churches, pressure will grow for voluntary accountability structures, financial transparency, and ethical standards. Some networks are already moving in that direction, creating codes of conduct, financial reporting requirements, and processes for addressing misconduct while maintaining local church autonomy. Fifth, theological diversity within non-denominational Christianity will probably increase. Without shared confessions or creeds, beliefs and practices will drift further apart. You might have one non-denominational church that's theologically conservative and another that's progressive, with little in common except their independent structure. This raises the question, at what point are they even the same thing anymore? If there's no shared theology, practice, or identity beyond, we're not denominational, what actually unites non-denominational Christianity as a movement? Sixth, we'll likely see continued transfer growth as denominations continue declining. More and more Christians will leave struggling denominational churches for thriving independent ones. This will accelerate the collapse of some denominations while fueling non-denominational growth. But here's the wild card. Will non-denominational churches be able to reverse the broader trend of declining Christianity in America? Or are they just rearranging deck chairs? The data is mixed. While non-denominational churches are growing as a percentage of Christians, the overall number of Christians in America is declining. Pew Research predicts the number of Americans identifying as Christian could fall below 50% in coming decades. Currently, it's at 64%. So non-denominational churches are winning a bigger slice of a shrinking pie. They're gaining market share but not necessarily expanding the market. The real test will be whether these churches can reach truly unchurched people, those who grew up with no religious background, rather than just attracting Christians who are switching churches. Some non-denominational churches are successfully doing this, creating entry points for people with no church background. Others are primarily serving refugees from other churches. Finally, let's grapple with the deeper question. What does all this mean for Christianity's identity and unity? For 2,000 years, despite all its diversity, Christianity has maintained some sense of shared identity. There have always been creeds, councils, traditions, and structures that connected Christians across time and space. Denominations, for all their problems, were part of that connective tissue. They said, "We're Lutherans, connected to the Reformation and to Luther's theology." Or, "We're Catholics, connected to Peter and the apostolic succession." Identity was rooted in something bigger than the local congregation. Non-denominational Christianity says, "We're just Christians. We don't need those labels." On one hand, that's beautifully simple and unifying. It strips away divisions and focuses on what's essential. On the other hand, it's potentially fragmenting. Without shared identity markers, what connects one non-denominational church to another? What connects Christians to their history? What prevents Christianity from splintering into thousands of isolated communities with nothing in common? Ryan Burge poses the question, if Christianity no longer needs denominations, what will unite the church in the future? Maybe technology and media provide new forms of connection. Christian podcasts, worship music, conferences, and online communities create networks that transcend local churches. You might attend a non-denominational church locally but feel connected to a broader movement through shared media and personalities. Maybe networks and associations become the new denominations, providing connection and resources without formal hierarchy. Maybe unity comes through shared mission and values rather than shared institutions. Christians united by commitment to justice, compassion, evangelism, or worship regardless of their organizational structures. Or maybe Christianity simply becomes more fragmented, with less shared identity and more diversity of belief and practice than ever before. Time will tell, but we're living through a pivotal moment in Christian history. The structures that shaped Christianity for centuries are crumbling or transforming, and what emerges will define faith for generations to come. Here's what we know for certain. Millions of people are voting with their feet. They're leaving denominational churches and embracing independent ones. They're seeking community over institution, relevance over tradition, belonging over labels. Non-denominational churches are meeting needs that traditional denominations haven't met. They're creating spaces where people feel welcome, known, and connected. They're adapting to cultural change rather than resisting it. But they're also taking risks, operating without the accountability, theological depth, and historical rootedness that denominations provided. The rise of non-denominational Christianity is neither simply good nor simply bad. It's complex, multifaceted, and still unfolding. What's clear is that this isn't a temporary blip. This is a fundamental realignment of American Christianity. The religious landscape of 2050 will look nothing like the landscape of 1950. And non-denominational churches are at the center of that transformation. For those who love denominations, this trend is heartbreaking. It represents the loss of traditions, structures, and identities that have been cherished for centuries. For those who've been hurt or constrained by denominations, this trend is liberating. It represents freedom, authenticity, and a return to what they see as the heart of faith. For those trying to understand what's happening in American religion, this trend is fascinating. It reveals deep currents in culture about institutions, authority, community, and how people search for meaning in the 21st century. And for the future of Christianity globally, this trend is pivotal, because the model being developed in American non-denominational churches is spreading worldwide, shaping how billions of people will experience faith. We're witnessing a revolution, not a violent overthrow, but a quiet, massive shift in how Christianity organizes itself and what it means to be part of the church. And the revolution is far from over. If this video helped you understand this massive transformation, share it with someone who needs to see it. Whether you're part of a denomination, a non-denominational church, or no church at all, this trend affects the religious landscape we all inhabit. Leave a comment. Are you part of this shift? Have you left a denomination for a non-denominational church, or vice versa? What do you think is driving this change? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.